Japan government efforts continue here in Korea to mitigate the impact of Japan's second round of trade restrictions. Korean firms are also bracing for the worst case scenario as Tokyo's decision to remove Seoul off its whitelist of trading partners looks set to affect imports of hundreds of materials, components, equipment, and other staple goods relevant to numerous industries. Today, we go in depth on Japan's economic retaliation against Korea and what to expect ahead. For that, Dr. Jun-sok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea, joins me in the studio. It's always good to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
So Japan is citing security reasons for slapping further trade restrictions against South Korea. Japanese Industry Minister Hiroshige Seko said Japan is merely reviewing its export controls to ensure national security. How do you see his remark? Is this a sufficient enough reason?
Okay, well, they did change the classification scheme a little bit to ABCD system. Oddly enough, though, the only country that was really affected was Korea. Whether Korea deserved to be reclassified in that way, well, the Institute for Science and International Security, which rates export controls for different countries, they actually rated Korea's export controls as being better than Japan's controls. Korea was ranked 17th out of the countries surveyed. Japan was only rated 36. And then in addition, I think Japan is losing its diplomatic battle to make this seem like merely a security or a trade issue. We have articles from United States like New York Times, Washington Post, or Europe, such as Financial Times and The Economist magazine, or international press like Bloomberg, saying that the cause for this Korea-Japan trade spat is the reparation issue, not a security issue. So if they wanted to convince the international public that this was due to security reclassification, they've been doing a bad job.
Tightening export controls, I've heard that one before from U.S. President Trump as well. Well, Japan's whitelist of trading partners will be proclaimed officially on Wednesday, the day after tomorrow. And after a 21 notification period, it'll take effect from the 28th. But it's not yet clear how Japan will go about implementing those export controls. Expectations?
The very idea of putting Korea off the whitelist is that now Japan will look at this case by case, industry by industry, good by good. So I expect they'll use several different types of classification schemes, several different types of approval scheme, but it seems pretty obvious that how it's going to work is that any good where there'll be a lot of pain for Korea will be restricted more, whereas a lot of goods which are expected to hurt Japanese exporters more will be more loosely restricted. There's a lot of goods where Japanese exporters depend on the Korean market. Automobile parts, for some chemicals, those are especially those which are made by Japanese small and medium-sized businesses. Apparently their major market is Korea, and their business will suffer greatly if the Korean market is cut off. So obviously for those goods, I think they're going to have a very loose export control, whereas some crucial chemicals like the ones that we've been talking about, semiconductors, they'll be controlled rather strictly.
Well, it sounds like it'll be a very carefully calculated export controls. Now, the possibility of any unexpected changes to the current situation, perhaps during the 21-day notification day period, any chances of Japan rolling back its decision due to some kind of an important variable?
I would be very surprised if that happens. I mean, I won't rule it out. Maybe there'll be an event that's so big that they'll have to ignore this. But because Prime Minister Abe has put so much political capital into this, and because at least for now there seems to be a very large, strong support from the Japanese public as well as the Japanese Diet, that I think it'll be very difficult for President Abe, even if he wanted to, and I don't think he wants to, but even if he wanted to, I think he cannot roll it back at this point.
So that's very unlikely. Japan's export curbs against South Korea is expected to have a huge impact on the Korean economy across numerous industries. How much impact would it have, though, on Korea's economic growth? The Bank of Korea lowered its forecast for this year to 2.2% last year, although that didn't really reflect Japan's export curbs.
Well, even the 2.2% I think was going to be difficult to achieve. If we look at the numbers, the first quarter growth this year was minus 0.4%. The second quarter growth was 1.1%. So roughly for the first half of the year, Korean economy grew only by 0.7%. That means if we wanted to achieve 2.2% growth, we'd have to have about 1.4 to 1.6% growth in the second half of the year. Now, last year, during the second half of the year, we grew about 1.2 to 1.4%. There's a bit of an ambiguity there because how the prices are calculated. But still, if we wanted to achieve 2.2% growth this year, we would have had to do slightly better in the second half of this year than what we did second half of the last year. And even before even before Japan put Korea off the whitelist, that was going to be very difficult. And now it's going to be even more difficult. Right now, it's a bit depressing, but I think even 2.0% will be very difficult.
Now, the Kosdaq, Korea's tech-heavy secondary stock market, fell below the 600 for the first time in 3 years, triggering a sidecar trading suspension. What would you say are the main causes behind this rare event?
Okay, well, I really expected the stock market to fall last week at the Thursday and Friday. What we typically believe happens in the stock market is that when stock market expects something to happen, they carry out their actions beforehand when they get new expectations. Now, what seems to have happened is that people reacted after the action rather than before the action. The large fall in the Kospi and especially the large fall in Kosdaq started off because a lot of foreign investors started selling off their stocks. I suspect, I haven't seen the numbers, but I suspect that they're mostly from Americas and the Europeans because by the time they heard the news, Korean stock market was already over for that day because of the time difference. So they started selling off the stock this morning, and then the Korean individual investors, I think, panicked. So if you look at the numbers today, it's mostly the international investors as well as the individual Korean investors who sold off their stock, and the Korean institutional investors who bought the stock but nowhere near enough to compensate. And the Kospi fell by 2.56%, Kosdaq fell by 7.46%, and Kosdaq obviously will take the higher hit because, well, their Kosdaq stocks are technology-oriented companies, and they're the ones who's going to be hurt the most by the Japanese move to put Korea off the whitelist.
The Asian stocks plummeted today on re-escalating U.S.-China trade tensions as well. What's your forecast for the Asian markets for the time being and in the long run? Okay,
well, because the Asian countries are all tied into the global supply chain, I think at least for now the bigger problem, at least for the Asian region, will be the U.S.-China trade war. And because U.S. will be now putting tariffs on all Chinese exports. That's going to affect all the Asian countries who supply parts to China. So that's going to be, I think, a more permanent effect. And then the Japanese move to put Korea off the whitelist is having an additional shock on top of that. It will have effect on Asian countries because, well, if Japan uses the whitelist to restrict materials for Korean production, then Korean production of things like semiconductors, intermediate parts will be affected as well. But we don't know exactly how strict Japan is going to be with that export restriction. We're going to have to wait until about early October to see exactly what Japan does. So I think that part of the shock may be more temporary. But basically, Asian market had such a big problem today because it was hit both with a permanent shock as well as a temporary shock from Korea, Japan. And another factor which I think affected was that it was really a bit of a surprise that President Trump removed or decided to put the tariffs on Chinese product. Just the day before, he said he was satisfied with how the negotiations were going. So this was really a big surprise, and that's partially why the Asian markets were affected so much.
Now, Korea's trade ministry today laid out measures that can help the nation secure the supply of 100 strategic core items within 5 years in efforts to counter Japan's export curbs. And that includes slicing some 1 trillion Korean won from next year's budget to support that. How effective do you think these measures will be in tackling the issue?
Okay, well, I was happy to see that they put a lot of money into R&D. I was happy to see that they dealt with some structural issues, but I was also disappointed that they didn't deal with very deep structural issues. So let me just go into that a bit more. Korea put a lot of money into R&D, 7.8 trillion won on R&D over the next 7 years. Korea also is going to make about 2.5 trillion won available for M&A, so that if Korea cannot make the goods in Korea, develop the goods in Korea, then perhaps we can buy other countries which have the technology. So I think those are basically good moves. But R&D doesn't guarantee that we'll have all these products ready in a year or 5 years. R&D doesn't work on schedule. So there's a bit of an uncertainty there. But also, one of the problems that Korea always had was how to commercialize the things that Korean scientists or Korean engineers develop. In order to commercialize, you not only need the technology, but you also need a lot of support for startups, and you need to have, well, perhaps not a guaranteed profits for a few 5-10 years, but at least a chance of making a continual profit over that period of time. And some of the policies that Korea announced today, well, they announced some help for startups, they announced some financial assistance. That's going to help. So those are, I think, fairly good moves on the country's part. But also, Korea announced beforehand that we'll probably waive the 52-hour work hour for the semiconductor-related companies. They're going to loosen some of the regulations. That's good. There has been a lot of complaints that testing these chemicals, whether they can be used, non-Japanese chemicals can be used in the production process, was being held up because there's not enough work hours during the week since the 52-hour work week law was started. They're going to loosen that, and I'm happy to see that, but I'm not sure if that'll be extended to other products that are covered in the 100-item list. It definitely should be if we're very serious about this. And then finally, the areas that we haven't really covered are things that deals with a lot of Korean laws and regulations, environment. Some people have commented that one of the reasons why Korean chemicals have not developed that much was because Korean environmental laws and regulations were too tough. That was not really addressed. And then even if the laws and regulations are changed, you're going to have a lot of problems with interest groups. Taking the chemicals as an example, a lot of people are going to be very scared of having a chemical factory in their backyard because they're not assured that they're safe. So unless we have a system of managing these interest groups, even if we get these new products developed in the R&D process, well, if we cannot build the factories, how can we produce these items? That's one of the reasons why we lost the market to Japan. So some of these deeper structural issues will have to be dealt with, and those were not really included in today's policy plans.
Now, one last question for you. We only have about a few seconds left. President Moon Jae-in today said the realization of a peace economy through inter-Korean economic cooperation could be an answer to deal with Japan's export curbs. How do you see his remarks? How realistic, though, is this?
I think that is very, very long term. I think perhaps we should concentrate more on what we're facing right now, and then we can make the long-term plans a bit later on. But for now, let's concentrate on the problems that we have right now.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Yang, for your perspectives tonight.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching.